All right. I see that the participants are accepting, so we'll just give everybody a couple minutes to join the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, for those of you on. All right. I think our numbers are pretty stable, so we'll go ahead and start. Sorry for the few-minute delay there, but hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first of hopefully many collaborative presentations by Basel Action Network and SERI, so the administrators of e-Steward standard as well as the administrators of the R2 standard. So today we will be discussing the Basel Convention amendments and really what they mean for electronic recyclers. So before we do move forward, in case anybody did not hear that notification, I would like to inform everybody in this webinar that we are recording so that we may make it available on our respective websites for additional study or future reference. If you do not consent to being recorded, please feel free to exit the webinar at any time. Also, just another notification, as we do continue through the presentation, please submit any questions that you may have for the presenters through the Q&A function, which should be on the bottom of your screen. As we get to the Q&A section towards the end of the presentation, we will address each of the questions in an orderly fashion. So, Jim, if you're able to go to the second slide there.
Are you seeing it?
Yes, you just need to go into the view mode or presentation mode.
Okay.
Perfect. All right, so in today's presentation, we will first start off with an introduction from the presenters, followed by reviewing the Basel Convention basics, and then followed by the plastic waste amendments that entered into force in January of 2021, the e-waste amendments that will go into force in January of 2025, really what this means for R2 and e-Stewards certified processors, and then we'll end the presentation with a Q&A. Gonna head to the next. Perfect. Today's speakers feature Jim Puckett, the founder and executive director of the Basel Action Network, Mike Easterbrook, the chief of global standards of SERI, and then myself, Selena Turnock, the certification director for e-Stewards. We do want to mention that we're all witnessing a little bit of history here today, as this is the first webinar that is done jointly with BAN and SERI, and hopefully, like I mentioned, many more to come. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Jim and Mike for introductions and to say a few words about how really this opportunity came about. So Jim, I will hand it over.
Sure. Thank you so much, Selena. Yeah, and hope everyone's having a great summer. Good morning, good afternoon to you all. About last year, about this time, we were very distressed to learn that a lot of the U.S. recyclers were exporting their plastic waste, which had become controlled by the new amendments that went into force in 2021, primarily to Malaysia, despite those amendments saying that those exports would be illegal in Malaysia. This was very concerning. We knew we couldn't just go this alone and alert the whole industry by ourselves. So we reached out to SERI. You might have all seen the op-ed that SERI and BAN did together, Corey and I. And that was the beginning of a joint effort to educate the industry and alert the industry, hopefully in a more timely manner, as to developments at Basel as they affect our industry. We hope together with our op-ed before this webinar and future initiatives that we take, that we can bring the entire industry into an ethical and legal circular economy. This webinar, of course, is part of that. We're going to go into depth, and I wanted to hand over quickly for Mike to say a few comments about what this all means.
Well, thank you, Jim. Glad to be here today collaborating on this. And I think it is important to kind of show those in the industry what these requirements are so that they may better understand them and know how they apply to their respective facilities and their shipments so that they can put that into their legal compliance in accordance with their requirements under this standard. So glad to be here. Thank you, Jim, and go for it.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, both SERI and BAN absolutely believe that, legal compliance is not an option. So this is why we're here. It's something we all got to do, whether the law is in our jurisdiction or another jurisdiction. If our activities impact something that's illegal, we need to be aware and put a stop to that. I'm not sure, Selena, if you mentioned the Q&A method, but we're going to be taking in questions with the tab at the bottom. You should see it says Q&A. You can just write them in there and we'll take them all at the very end. So without further ado, as I said, we're going to respond to the kind of questions we've been receiving, which are not all just basic. There are some really in-depth questions. And these kind of amendments, the devil is in the details. So we are going to get a bit detailed here. So buckle up and we'll try to take you first through the basics more quickly and then slow down when it gets into the actual coming amendment. So Basel is the only treaty on waste in the world. We consider it a global environmental justice treaty, the first of its kind. It was created in 1989 to respond to global waste dumping that was really epidemic in the late 1980s, with container ships flying around the world dumping their waste in different jurisdictions. The convention entered into force in 1992. It adopted the Basel Ban Amendment in 1995. It's what a lot of the developing countries wanted at the outset, which was a ban on the export of all types of hazardous waste from developed to developing countries. So that was adopted in 1995, and that came into force in 2019. Currently, there are 191 parties or members of the treaty. The US, unfortunately, is of but 5 non-parties. So of all the UN countries, there's only 5 left, US included, that are not part of the game. And so you can see the map of the world with the non-parties indicated, so it's a lot easier to see how glaring the exception is that the US is not part of this vital international treaty. The other countries are East Timor, Fiji, Haiti, South Sudan, that are also not part of this Rules of the Road treaty. What does Basel do? It has a lot of general obligations which set the tone. Those are called soft law, and it calls for national self-sufficiency in waste management. In other words, minimizing all forms of transboundary movement of hazardous and other waste. Very important, this other waste we'll be talking about. Calls for minimizing the generation of hazardous and other waste. So don't make so much, try to prevent it. And if you can't prevent it, calls for ensuring environmentally sound management of that which is produced. Now that soft law is not going to end up directly in the national laws of countries or put anybody in jail. It's the hard law where we need to really look at what it does in actually trying to control the transboundary movement of waste. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to define what the scope is. And the scope, as we mentioned, is either hazardous waste or other waste. And that definition, hazardous waste, is according to annexes 1, 3, and 8. And you can find those in the convention. And of course, there's also the possibility that any country has the sovereign right to declare something to be controlled for them. And every other country has to respect that. So it's another way of creating a hazardous waste definition, is by national signaling to the community that they consider something hazardous. The other waste category, kind of funny that it's just called other waste, but it is actually an annex of wastes that are considered other wastes or waste for special consideration. And that originally was just waste collected from households, like household garbage, and incinerator ashes from incinerating household garbage. That was how it was for years and years. And then the plastic amendments happened, and they got an entry on other waste as Y48. And now, the beginning of next year, we're going to have another entry. So this is really the focus of activity in the convention, is more and more things are being added to this other waste Annex 2 category. This is really the topic of today's talk, is these number 3 and 4 additions. So what does Basel do with those definitions? It's going to control things, and it can control things in 2 different ways primarily. The prior informed consent regime is the default method. That means the exporting country can't export something, or a party in that country can't export something unless it has the consent. And the way they get that consent is they have to notify the receiving country prior to the shipment and get consent. That prior informed consent is called PIC. It's defined in Article 6 of the Convention, and everyone knows there's improvements underway to make it more streamlined, but that is the basic default control mechanism of the Basel Convention. They also define when you don't do PIC right, that's illegal traffic. That's defined in Article 9, and illegal traffic is meant to be a criminal act according to the convention. So every country has to prosecute people not abiding by the PIC procedure. But then there's prohibitions. So if PIC is not applying, the other way the treaty controls things is through prohibitions. And there's a few that we need to talk about. The first is that parties may ban imports nationally. So remember, when China said we're not going to take any more waste of many kinds, that was a national ban. They did that on their own. They notified the Basel Secretariat, and all the parties were notified. Another ban that's implicit is exports to Antarctica are in the treaty. I don't think anybody's planning to do that. But very important, there's a ban on trade between parties and non-parties. And of course, why that is so important is the US, as I'd mentioned before, is a non-party. And there's an exception to that, which is called an Article 11 agreement. But those Article 11 agreements have to be as rigorous and environmentally sound as the treaty itself. But you can create them. And the OECD has created one of those, and that always enters into the picture. There's some smaller ones as well. Bilateral agreements like between Canada and the USA, for example. And then there's the Basel Ban Amendment, which I mentioned, which is now new Article 4A, which is that prohibition of hazardous waste from developed to developing countries. The one that's really going to play a big role in this discussion today is this party to non-party ban. It applies to other wastes as well. So any controlled waste, if a non-party is involved, like the United States, nobody can trade with them absent an Article 11 agreement. So let's look at the plastic amendments. I think it's important that we look at them again because we're still seeing widespread non-compliance, a lot of shipments still moving, primarily to Malaysia, of what it should be controlled as Y48. So why were the plastic amendments created? Real quickly, I'll go through that history. Mentioned that China had banned everything back in 2018. They used to be the focal point for so much of the waste, not just plastic, but all kinds of waste. In March of 2018, they said no more unless the purity of the material was 99.5%. This created, as you can imagine, a major market disruption. There was a film called Plastic China. If you haven't seen it, it's worth looking at because it's a very influential film that was banned almost immediately. It was shown in China, but it had a huge impact. It looked at the human implications, the human effects of the trade of these little villages, many all over China that were receiving the plastic waste, what it meant to the workers and people that lived there. The filmmaker himself grew up in one of these villages, and it painted a really ugly picture. After the ban, as I mentioned, there was a major market disruption. As you can see in the left-hand side in 2017, before the national sword went down and the national sword policy of China banned the imports, they were getting 60% of the G7's plastic waste flowing into China and Hong Kong. After the national sword in 2018, they were getting less than 10%. You can see it started flowing to countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Taiwan, etc. And that's what happened. After the Chinese national sword went into effect, the plastic waste primarily moved to Southeast Asia. And the impacts there were being reported on by journalists and NGOs and others as horrific situations where a lot of open burning was taking place, a lot of dumping in rural areas. And this really created an impact on the global community and the decision makers at the United Nations, for example. The other big issue that was going on was marine pollution by plastics. And many were realizing that this was a serious problem. We were getting more plastics in the ocean than fish. And this was another huge impetus to creating these amendments. And then the Basel Convention was really the only legally binding treaty ready to go. They were thinking about making a whole new treaty, and that is underway now, a global treaty on the life cycle of plastics. But Basel was ready to go to deal with the trade issue. And so Norway stepped up and proposed these amendments. And they passed in 2019. They're now in force as of 2021. So the intention of these amendments was to ensure control and transparency via the PIC procedure for exports and imports of plastic waste, which are most likely to cause harm, particularly to developing countries and the marine environment, including after recycling. This is what the amendment looked like, that we had never seen a listing this complicated before. There are actually 3 listings here. I'll go into it and make it simple for you real quickly here. So the idea was to make all plastics waste fit into 3 different listings. The first listing would be non-hazardous, B3011. Then the next listing would be hazardous plastic waste, A3210. And then this other listing, Y48, which really should be everything else that's not in the hazardous or non-hazardous listing. This was the new wrinkle. We had already had non-hazardous plastic and hazardous plastic in the convention. The new wrinkle was this everything else being captured. And as I mentioned before, we only had 2 before that were in this other category, Annex 2. Now we have mixed and contaminated plastics. That's shorthand for that big 2-pager that you saw earlier. It's a lot more complicated than just mixed and contaminated. That's good shorthand to describe what was being encompassed. So the attributes of Annex 2 are very important. This will apply not only here, but in the e-waste amendments as well. But look at neither can be asserted as hazardous or non-hazardous if it's on the Annex 2. We don't really know for sure sometimes. But it's seen as needing trade controls to protect the environment and provide transparency, regardless of whether it's hazardous or not. And this is usually due to the likelihood of improper management. For example, informal recycling or dumping due to proper recycling being uneconomic. And these wastes that are on this annex are not impacted by the ban amendment. The ban amendment only deals with hazardous waste. The default control procedure is PIC, as I mentioned, and it's extremely important to know that trade with the US or other non-parties will be illegal for Basel parties. For example, countries importing from the US or exporting to the US. It's a no-go. There are 4 types of waste which define the non-hazardous B3011, and those include plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one non-halogenated polymer, so like PE, PP, PET, ABS, etc. The important thing here is it's just one. They can't be mixed. Second is a similar situation with cured resins or condensation products. Again, they can't be mixed. They have to be single. And third, plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one of a short list of fluorinated polymer wastes that are listed. And those also have to be single and not mixed. And finally, there's one mixture that's allowed, and that's PE, PP, and PET can be mixed, provided that at the destinations they're separated and recycled and are free from contamination. So those are the exemptions to being controlled as plastic. Anything other than those 4 categories must be controlled either as hazardous plastic waste. This is really rare. Most countries are not enforcing the hazardous additives that are in the plastics. That's going to come later. I can predict. But right now, most of the concern is about waste for special consideration. Commonly, this is going to be a big issue, not just for electronics, e-plastics, but for all kinds of plastics that are collected on MRFs and cities, etc. This is the Y48. This is the most important issue. So the controls for Y48 and A3210, normally it's going to be prior informed consent. There's going to need to be assurances of environmentally sound management. But in 3 key instances, a full ban is in effect. And those are exports from Basel parties of A3210, the hazardous plastics, again, that's not common, will be banned because of the Basel ban amendment. And in Europe, the 7 EU countries have done something special. They take Annex 2 and add it to the ban amendment. So they are going to also ban the exports of this Y48 plastics to any developing countries. That's already in force. And the final ban is imports and exports involving the US. Again, are banned with the exception of Canada, because Canada signed a bilateral agreement with the US, and that's due to the party to non-party ban. So those are serious implications there. Now, e-waste, as most of you on the call know, most recyclers are not capable of separating the polymers. They never had to do that before. And there are many polymers making up computer plastics. There's like 10 or so. And because that lack of separation, in the past, they've just been bailed up, similar to this picture here. It's Y48. And Y48 has all those restrictions, including exports from the United States to a Basel party, except for Canada. And yet we know this is happening. It's happening right now. We're trying to track it. This is a Scrappo screenshot showing somebody trying to get rid of a bunch of TV housings, and they're trying to sell them as ABS. And they even show this picture of obviously massive piles outdoors of this material. It is not strictly ABS, but this is how they're exporting it, not using the proper tariff code of HS 3915 for plastic scrap. They're using a tariff code of ABS and smuggling it out in that way. Unfortunately, countries like Malaysia are accepting it, and we're working on putting a stop to that to get everybody compliant. So to sum up on the plastics, the implications for US recyclers is that non-OECD Basel parties will not be able to receive any Y48 plastics from the United States, a non-party. OECD Basel parties, with the exception of Canada, cannot legally accept Y48 plastics from the United States, a non-party. It may be possible, if you can convince both countries to agree, to export Y48 to the OECD as hazardous plastic, because that is accepted at the OECD level. And so the OECD agreement can be used as an Article 11 agreement. You could send it as A3210, but of course with prior informed consent. Malaysia will be under increasing pressure to enforce Basel, particularly against US exports coming to them. This discussion is underway as we speak. Some companies will seek to fill the void of a lack of plastic separators and recyclers in North America. We really welcome and applaud this. But as you've been reading in eScrap News and other places, many companies are weighing into this field to try to fix this lack of capacity. In the meantime, to be compliant, we're fearful that recyclers will be forced to landfill plastic waste that cannot be recycled. EPR programs will be seriously impacted. So that's the story on the plastics waste. If you have any questions, make sure you put them in the appropriate box on the Q&A tab there. We will make this show completely available, and so you can study these slides later. So I would suggest, instead of taking thorough notes, that you think of which questions you really want to ask, and we hopefully will get to those at the end. So the new e-waste amendments. This is to let people know, hopefully well in advance of what's happening in January 1, 2025. A very similar thing is going to happen as what happened with plastics. And it's hard to know which is going to be most impactful. It's hard to look into the crystal ball and figure out, how much things are going to be shaken up by this. I'm always surprised, and it's almost impossible to predict everything, but we're going to do our best. Why these e-waste amendments happened, very similar logic to the plastics. We need to start controlling this material. So much harm is caused, not just by hazardous plastics, but by the bad processing of any type of e-waste, including the plastics. So much of the track record and higher risk that's being seen in the developing world is not just from the hazardous plastics. E-waste. Places more e-waste exports under the control procedures, allowing countries the transparency to know what is coming into the country and where it's going, and providing the right of refusal. This was seen as important. The countries that sponsored this, as you recall, are Switzerland and Ghana, but they had a lot of backing. This did pass by consensus. This report done by IPIN kind of paints the picture of the problem. Ghana was found with some scientific analysis to have the highest levels of brominated dioxins ever found in the chicken eggs around the dump site at Agbogbloshie in Ghana. And the people were consuming and are still consuming these chicken eggs with some of the highest levels of dioxins ever found on Earth. This is from the burning of electronics, whether it's hazardous or not. This is what happens. The other concern was that it's very expensive to determine whether something's hazardous or not. So some countries just wanted to control everything, and this does that basically. And it's looking to a future where we hope electronics will become less hazardous as we change the design through green design initiatives, but it's still very likely to cause harm. So this is what we need to anticipate and put in the PIC procedure. And again, I believe this really benefits legitimate recyclers who are not just packing and shipping, but gives them back their competitive edge for those that are doing that, because everything now will be controlled. Real quickly, want to show you what's happening in Malaysia. This is from one.
An illegal e-waste recycling facility hidden within a palm oil plantation in Tikam Batu has been extracting over 10 million ringgit worth of precious metals monthly, causing severe environmental damage. Authorities raided the 160,000 square foot facility run by local and Chinese nationals exploiting Bangladeshi labor workers. A detained Chinese employee claimed the facility rakes in over 100 million ringgit annually. Documents revealed transactions with various companies selling industrial waste and purchasing extracted metals. Over 350 metric tons of e-waste were seized during the raid, and 9 Bangladeshi workers and 1 Chinese national were detained for immigration offenses.
This was just 1 week ago, and we are seeing now another huge wave of e-waste, hazardous or otherwise, that's moving out of the United States into countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates. And we have been notifying the Malaysian authorities. You might have seen the story where they seized 106 illegal containers of 453 containers that we've notified them about. 301 of them are still being investigated. But we're seeing a resurgence here. So we do have a serious problem. We're here to warn you, this is not compliance. This is not what we should be doing with our hazardous or other e-waste. And it is a serious problem. And so we're really going to welcome these amendments and just want to make sure that the industry is prepared to deal with them. What the e-waste amendments do, they're going to replace the old listing of hazardous e-waste with a similar new one, A1181. They're going to completely remove the old listing for non-hazardous e-waste, which had no controls before. That's gone. So everything is going to be controlled. You don't have an option of having any controls except for one avenue, which we'll discuss. And it is establishing a new Annex 2 listing Y49. And of course, Annex 2 requires the PIC procedure. So everything will be controlled, not necessarily banned, depending on where you are in the world, but it will be controlled at least by the PIC procedure. So in sum, all e-waste exports, regardless of hazardousness, will be controlled. The new hazardous entry, I'm not going to go in great depth here because it's very similar. It basically says that the bullet points that you see there, those are the important things. It says waste electrical and electronic equipment. So we're talking about whole equipment that's contaminated with Annex 1 materials to a degree that they created hazardous characteristics. It also includes those equipment containing components that are also hazardous. And they kind of predict which ones that are of concern. It's a non-exhaustive list here. Certain circuit boards, certain display devices, et cetera, kind of signaling what you need to be concerned about. But the new wrinkle here in this definition is they flag up these other two bullet points, waste components. So it can just be a component, not a whole computer, for example. And then further, waste arising from the processing. So this can include fractions like shred materials, dismantled parts, et cetera. So at any level of breakdown, they're controlling it as A1181. So again, we had that list of Annex 2. We had mixed and contaminated plastics. Now we've added another one, Y49. Again, the attributes of what it is to be on Annex 2 are the same, needing trade controls despite whether it's hazardous or not, due to bad management as a likelihood. The default control procedure is PIC. In the EU, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, Annex 2 is banned from export to non-OECD countries. So there, just like with the plastics, it's going to be banned coming out of the EU. And trade with the US, again, will be illegal for Basel parties. Now, the new entry Y49 is basically a mirror of the hazardous entry. And it says that, you know, if it doesn't contain all these hazardous problems, then it's going to be under Y49. But the interesting addition here is there's a big unless. And Ben actually worked really hard to promote this, even though it's not a perfect a resolution of a problem. It does say unless covered by another entry in Annex 2 or by an entry in Annex 9. So main thing to look at there is entries in Annex 9. So we've always told recyclers that if you can process things down to metal that's clean and plastics that's clean, et cetera, you'll be outside of the convention. You won't have to worry. Without this exemption in here, people would have had to worry about everything, starting from electronics all the way down, which doesn't really make a lot of sense for legitimate recyclers. So this exemption is very important, and we'll explore that. So unless covered by another entry in Annex 2 or by an entry in Annex 9, let's look at what that really means, because these are going to be green-lighted ways for processors to still maintain a free trade in things that are commodity-like. What are the exempted process e-waste? So looking at the first one, it's metal alloy waste in metallic, non-dispersible form, excluding mercury. So these have to be non-hazardous. They can't have solders on them. They have to have no mercury or lead, cannot have brominated flame retardants or things like that, no lithium-ion batteries in there, cannot have circuit board material, cannot be full of dust or granular material, need to be in chunks of metal, but they can be mixed. Another one is the clean unmixed plastic. This is the plastic we were talking about earlier. Again, it has to be single polymers with one exception, must be free from non-target substances, no contamination, cannot contain PVC, and it has to go to recycling, can't be landfilled, burned, or sent to waste to energy. But that is a fraction that will be exempt from the Y49. And scrap assemblies from electric power generation are also included here. They can't be contaminated with hazardous materials. In other words, they can't fail a TCLIP test, but they are also exempt as being on the Annex 9B list. This is an interesting one. The B list says waste batteries conforming to a specification that are not containing lead, cadmium, or mercury. They can't have other hazardous materials either. The question that's raised, why this is so interesting, is because of lithium-ion batteries. Will they be exempt from Y49 by this B1090 entry? Right now, Basel hasn't weighed in on this. They're looking at this whole issue with a new guideline, but the literature shows that these are considered hazardous because they contain flammable solvents and fluorinated compounds, plastics, etc., that would qualify them as A1181. So we would make the case that lithium-ion batteries right now are hazardous waste, hazardous e-waste. Black mass, on the other hand, which is the big soup of mixture of lithium-ion batteries made into a matrix that's not going to be flammable and is processed in different ways by different actors. Those we would consider as being one of the process residues that would be covered by Y49. So we wouldn't see this being in the B1090 category, but we predict that it will become Y49, black mass, and subject to control. And then we have waste metal cables coated or insulated with plastics. These are excluded as long as they're not hazardous and don't have lead or something in the lining, etc., in the plastics that would create a hazard. They cannot be going for thermal treatment and open burning, but they will be exempt. Then we have this interesting one of waste end-of-life motor vehicles, as long as they've been emptied of liquids and other hazardous substances. Well, most of you don't deal with waste end-of-life motor vehicles, but the parts from those, almost every car now is like a mobile computer and has numerous electronic parts. If an entire car can be exempt, if non-hazardous, the question is raised, wouldn't it be logical that starters or alternators, generators, etc., would also be exempt? However, this is not clear at all. So I think right now, those starters, alternators, etc., would be considered Y49, and only a whole car would be exempt. So one thing that's happened in the last year, once these amendments were adopted at COP15, Japan went to the OECD, and normally the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, 32 member countries, and so they have their own agreement, which is a valid Article 11 agreement under Basel, to trade amongst each other for recycling. They have their own agreement, and Japan's part of it, and the US is part of it. Ordinarily, the OECD automatically adopts the Basel listings unless there's an objection. Well, Japan objected to Y49. So what does that mean? Unfortunately for the US, this works to their detriment because almost every party of the OECD is a Basel party except the US, and they all are. So if the OECD doesn't adopt Y49, the US can't take advantage of the OECD agreement for Y49, and they're locked out of accessing those countries like Canada even, or Mexico, or European countries to trade in Y49 because of the Japanese objection. So this is a situation, unless Japan changes their mind before the end of the year, this is going to mean that the US is not going to be able to trade in Y49, and that includes Canada right now, because Canada has not done what they did with plastics. They have not created a bilateral agreement of any kind, which includes Y49. We've alerted Canada to this, but they have not committed to doing anything. So in sum, the implications for US recyclers on these new e-waste amendments is that US trade with OECD countries in Y49 will not technically be allowed. This includes the long borders of Mexico and Canada, unless the countries agree to use an existing bilateral agreement or create a new one. As an alternative, if you can get both countries to agree, it may be possible to export Y49 as hazardous e-waste, but that would be with PIC. And non-OECD Basel Party actors will not be able to legally import any e-waste from the US, such as Malaysia, unless it is first processed into Annex 9 waste, those exemptions, exceptions that we just mentioned. US actors will not be able to receive any kind of e-waste from non-OECD countries. And in some, e-waste which have never been subject to trade controls before, including those that don't contain focused materials or hazardous waste under the 2 certifications, now must be controlled either by PIC or by a full trade prohibition, unless, again, they are processed to become an Annex 9 listed waste. This encompasses not only legal controls, but also certification conformity, as certifications must abide by laws of all impacted jurisdictions. And at that, I'm going to finally turn it over to Mike and Selena. Oh, sorry, one more slide to go. These newly controlled e-wastes, which we're concerned about being looked at for the first time, I'm just going to summarize what we're looking at here, because this is really what you need to be concerned about. Are electronic car parts, electronic bicycle parts, motorcycles, electrical household appliances, electric toys, power supplies, mice and keyboards, uninterrupted power supplies and power packs, LED monitors, black mass from lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries, not as Y49, but as actual hazardous waste. So these things now are going to be controlled. So take note. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Selena to talk briefly about what it means for the certification, starting with Mike. Mike, are you there?
I am here. Thank you, Jim.
Awesome.
So first, I wanted to go over what this means for R2 in regards to the e-waste amendments. So would you bring up the next bullet? There we go. I wanted to reiterate this legal compliance point. You know, Basel has been incorporated into the laws of 191 countries in the world. So whether you're certified or not, this is a law that you need to adhere to when you move Basel controlled material internationally. Voluntary certification standards required that certified companies demonstrate they have a process in place for demonstrating their compliance with the applicable laws, and that their compliance audits are conducted by the certified organization. So if you think about it, many customers that require R2 or e-Stewards certification would expect legal compliance from that facility as a bare minimum. And not only that facility, but down through the recycling chain to end of disposition. That's why it's been reiterated a couple times that compliance is non-optional for certified companies. Next point, please. Thanks. So first of all, we got to think about this as it only applies when there's transboundary movement. If there is any type of transboundary movement, R2 facilities need to verify compliance with the applicable export, transit, and import requirements in accordance with Appendix A3. And these applicable requirements shall be added to the R2 facilities legal compliance plan under Core 4 and periodically audited. Next point, please. There's a couple considerations to think about. It's important to understand the condition and disposition of the material when there's a transboundary movements. So first of all, in some countries, equipment destined for direct reuse may not be considered waste. So there are conditions there, and there are certain OECD countries that non-OECD countries, excuse me, that do not allow the import of devices older than 5 years old, because those would be a waste and might be a waste soon. And for the R2 standard functional product is not a R2 controlled stream and not subject to R2 downstream control, but requirement core 4C1 says that the R2 facility must be able to demonstrate the legality of the import, export, and transit of functional equipment, or basically equipment, components, and materials. So that would also be necessary to add to the legal compliance plan. Secondly, there's equipment destined for legitimate repair and refurbishing, which is more nuanced. And there may be countries where this is not considered a waste, but there would need to be certain assurances, handling, and documentation requirements need to be met. And some countries outright prohibit it unless it's fully functional and ready for direct reuse by an end user, like Hong Kong. So these facilities need to look at the importing country's regulation and legislation and verify the compliance prior to the shipment. For those types of shipment, because it's an R2 controlled stream, specifically equipment and components for test and repair, and not considered functioning product, the R2 facility would need to qualify downstream vendors under Appendix A for test, repair, and refurbishment, and additionally, verify legality in accordance with Appendix A3 and document that in the legal compliance plan. Lastly, here, there's the destined for materials recovery. So whatever's not capable of reuse, repair, or has parts harvested already and is destined for materials recovery, recycling, these non-hazardous e-wastes are going to be controlled by Basel under Y49 starting January 1st, 2025. Previously, these non-hazardous e-waste could move to countries that allowed it under B1110, which, as Jim said, is no longer going to be a category. And it was true that it could move to OECD and non-OECD countries, not all. And so what does this mean for shipments to OECD and non-OECD countries now that these non-hazardous e-waste like power supplies, circuit boards, hard drives will be controlled? For non-OECD, it's going to be controlled by PIC. This means non-OECD to non-OECD would move through PIC, non-OECD to OECD would move by PIC. But what does this mean for non-party members like the US? It means they're going to be prohibited from trading in Y49 with non-parties, absent excuse me, the US will be prohibited from trading in Y49 with parties, absent a valid Article 11 agreement, of which there are none in place at this time. This means countries like maybe the Philippines or Indonesia's that might have allowed for the import of some of these non-hazardous e-waste previously will no longer be a legal option because the e-waste amendments have gone into effect. So the legality of the import there cannot be verified. For OECD, as Jim mentioned, there is an Article 11 agreement between the OECD to trade in waste controlled by Basel. And this allows non-party countries like the US to trade with party countries, basically everyone else in the OECD. This non-hazardous e-waste was categorized as GCO10 and GCO20 and was subject to the green control procedure, meaning that it did not need PIC to move. But will these trade of these non-hazardous e-waste now be controlled by PIC? So that's where it gets a little more complicated, and there could be differing views on that because the OECD came to a non-consensus outcome on the implementation of these e-waste amendments. So what the OECD could do is they could incorporate that into their Article 11 agreement. That means that it might be governed by each country's national legislation as long as it meets the same environmentally sound management standards of the convention. And then, so that is up in the air right now. The OECD countries have until January 15th, 2025 to communicate their updates with the OECD Secretariat for publication on the OECD website. And the R2 facility will need to understand these nuances, update their legal compliance plan accordingly. Can we go to the next slide, please, Jim? So again, for plastic waste, this is applicable when there's transboundary movement. You need to verify compliance to any applicable export, transit, and import requirements in accordance with Appendix A3. Next one, please. So e-plastics destined for international movement need to be classified properly according to the Basel codes that Jim went over in depth. So we already kind of went over those. B3011 is that single polymer except for those exceptions, and it's not controlled. So that can be traded freely. No pick, OECD, non-OECD. But to get plastics in this state, almost without a doubt, it requires further processing to separate polymers through additional processing mechanisms. Because electronics are manufactured with multiple polymer types like ABS, PS, PE, so on and so forth. A3210 are the hazardous plastics that can contain BFRs and other types of persistent organic pollutants, and Y48 is the plastic waste requiring special consideration. So if, as Jim kind of said, and I'll reiterate again, e-plastics recovered from either shredded e-waste or baled e-waste that has been separated from electronics through manual dismantling is almost always guaranteed to be Y48 and could be A3210. The reason, because of the mixed polymers, that it's Y48, and if they have BFRs, then it would be A3210. And without further treatment, all plastic output from this shredding activities, manual dismantling, that is not going any other treatment, you need to ensure that you're verifying the legality of the import and export and add these requirements to your legal compliance plan, understanding what categories that they will fall under if there's no further processing done of these plastics. Again, for non-OECD, this is easier and more straightforward. This is controlled through PIC. And again, that means that non-party members like the US will be prohibited in trading in Y48 and A3210 with non-parties, absent a valid Article 11 agreement. There are none in place at this time with non-OECD countries. That means countries like Malaysia cannot just receive shredded or baled plastic that hasn't undergone any further processing and therefore doesn't meet the criteria of B3011 from non-parties like the US. For the OECD, again, there were complications. The OECD did not adopt Y48 and A3210 because of objections to these codes. And it should be acknowledged that, you know, there's differing views on how this exactly works out within the OECD agreement, but I think it's important to present the information. You know, the OECD Council decision does have an entry in Appendix 4, Part 1F that states that the Basel entry Y48 does not apply, as no consensus has been reached among OECD members to incorporate this entry into the decision. As a result of this situation, each member company retains its right to control plastic waste covered by Basel entry Y48 in conformity with domestic legislation and international law. Member countries should inform the OECD Secretariat about their controls for plastic waste covered under this Basel entry Y48 by 15th January 2021, as well as any further changes of such controls in a timely manner. So that is published on the OECD website. And it lists out each country's national legislation. And so that was the result of the non-adoption of the categories Y48 and B3011. Facilities need to look at the importing OECD countries' national legislation, along with their own country's exporting legislation and regulations to verify the legality of controlled plastics, whether or not it's legal from OECD or OECD, and how that should be categorized, and add that to their legal compliance plan. The very last point is that in order to provide transparency in the downstream recycling chain, the R2 Technical Advisory Committee that oversees the development and maintenance of the R2 standard is recommending adding Y48 and A3210 to the R2 equipment categorization as an R2 controlled stream. So this means downstream vendors and brokers of plastic would need to be qualified in accordance with Appendix A. And the R2 TAC wanted to make this potential addition known to the industry and get this out there so that the industry could provide feedback to the R2 TAC to consider this decision. And that feedback window is open for the next month until August 15th, 2024. The link to the SERI site is on the next slide, along with the link to the OECD page for plastics by OECD country. So thank you very much for that. And I will hand it over now to Selena.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike and Jim. And I think I'm kind of the end cap here. So before we jump into the Q&A, but essentially going over specifically what this means for e-Stewards certified processors, a lot of it is very similar to what Mike discussed with the R2 here. And, first, and this is specific to the plastic waste amendments, legal compliance is, of course, not negotiable really in any situation. Law will always trump standard requirements. And secondly, all e-Stewards must conduct themselves as if the country in which they operate were a Basel party, which really is a requirement essentially geared towards those US-based processors, as the US is one of very few non-party countries. In recently adopted sanction interpretations to our version 4.1, which were adopted as of May 22nd of this year, the e-Stewards Standard Committee and community in general, because it did go for public comment, agreed to update the definition of a PCM or problematic component or material so that Y48 plastics now fall under that definition of a PCM rather than an HEW. So that is the intention there was to more closely align the standard to the Basel Convention and how this is separated by category. So this means that Y48 is subject to the Basel PIC procedure, as both Jim and Mike mentioned there, and that is in the case for Basel parties. For non-parties, it is subject to complete prohibition of trade unless there is a valid Article 11 agreement that exists. And currently for the plastic wastes, or those Y48, only one agreement is in place for the US to trade in Y48 with Canada specifically. Today, all e-Stewards are not allowed to export Y48 plastic waste to any country other than to Canada. And Y48 plastics from the US can be exported to other OECD countries as hazardous waste plastic under the code A3210. That one was adopted, the Y48 was not. We have actually published a guide with this information and other known downstream destinations for Y48 plastics. However, it is known that some of these plastics will possibly have to go to landfill or incineration due to a lack of compliant destinations in North America. We are aware of several destinations currently, but I think as everybody is pretty aware as well, there are certain capacity restrictions with some of that processing here in North America specifically. So just going over now, what does this mean in regards to the upcoming e-waste amendments? Of course, as we mentioned, same situation, legal compliance is not negotiable. Law must always be followed, no matter, the organization, or the country, or obviously the certification as well. Both require that. Again, all e-stewards must conduct themselves as if the country in which they operate were a Basel party. So again, that is really specific to the US, as we are a non-party country. And as we did with the Y48 plastics, we also included the Y49 e-waste to be considered as a PCM as of January 1st, 2025, when that goes into force. It will be subject to the Basel PIC procedures for Basel parties, and non-parties will not be able to trade in Y49 e-waste unless a valid Article 11 agreement exists. And as Mike also mentioned, currently there is no such agreement that exists for the US. So as of January 1st, 2025, all e-Steward certified processors must not allow any Y49 electronic waste to be exported to any country except to OECD countries under the Basel Code A1181, which I know Jim went forward or went to explain earlier in the presentation here. So following this webinar, all e-stewards will be asked to reconsider any exports they are currently making of Y49 e-waste. And again, take a look at that and see how that fits in with your legal compliance plan, as Mike mentioned as well. And there are some helpful links here included to not only the Basel Convention website. This mentions the Conference of the Party meeting reports. So this is helpful to see the actual plastic waste amendments, which are the decision BC 14-12. And then the e-waste amendments are located under decision BC 15-18. There's also some reference links here to our guide for plastic waste export compliance, which is available on our website, as well as the recently published sanction interpretations that further describe those changes that were made as far as the definition of where these Y48 and Y49 wastes fall. So I think that's pretty much everything. Thank you all so much for sitting through this. We will go through the Q&A here, and I see that we have several questions that were submitted, so thank you. And again, as you continue to think of some, please feel free to send those in, and we will go through them in order. Jim and Mike, do you want to mention anything before we jump into the Q&A section?
No, all good here.
I'm good.
All right. Okay, perfect. So starting off with the first one, which I think we kind of answered a little bit here, but we will just, quickly go through this. This was an anonymous attendee said, perhaps it would be helpful to provide companies or resources where certified recyclers can send plastic to domestic processors, which I know, we mentioned is available in our guide for the plastic waste export. Does that domestic processing even exist currently? And when CBs mandate a significant change like this with no solution, compliance can be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. So I don't know if we want to start there.
Yeah.
There's more to that question, but if we want to start there, and then we can wrap that up afterwards.
Well, just to say that we're very sympathetic to the situation. We've stuck our nose into this and realized that, yeah, there's limited capacity in North America. Our guide was to provide people the starting points of where they could explore that capacity. We do recognize the guide needs to be updated. Things are really in flux. More and more people are getting into the game of separating through float sink technology, the polymers, and you can see these announcements very often on eScrap News. But we will be updating that guide in the fall, and so look for that. We'll be sending it out to everyone, not just e-stewards.
All right. So the second part of this, Mike, might be a little bit more directed to you. It says R2 recyclers are at a disadvantage because e-stewards already have a relationship with some domestic plastic processors and are meeting the feedstock volume needs. So as certified recyclers, they did mention we all want to operate in compliance with legal requirements and do the right thing. So I don't know, Mike, if you have anything to add there as far as what SERI may be doing for R2 companies.
The plastic recyclers in North America have expressed to me lately that they do have capacity, like Panil, Eco, PRI, and BOMET specifically. I know that there are R2 and e-Stewards facilities doing their own processing of plastics. I don't know if they have any capacity, but those three companies that are listed on the e-Stewards plastic guidance do say that there is capacity. So I would check with them before determining what to do.
Perfect. All right, so on to the second question here. It says, to clarify, would plastics containing flame retardants fall under the Y48 or B3011 category?
Like 83210.
Yeah,
Jim, do
the flame retardants and other additives are not getting the scrutiny they need to have, but you can expect it's going to tighten considerably, and they're going to be considered as hazardous and not Y48 increasingly. Some countries are already doing it. Some are doing it for some flame retardants and not others, but it's a really good question. I believe you should make an assumption that brominated flame retardants are going to be considered hazardous by a lot of countries, and you should find other avenues for those.
Okay, so neither in this case, and it would be A3210 for that.
Correct.
All right. Another person asked, what about exports to Mexico? And I'm assuming from the US here.
Yeah, Mexico is in an interesting situation. With the plastics, the US only signed a bilateral arrangement, they called it, with Canada and not with Mexico. And we've looked very closely into this situation and realized that Mexico there's no legal basis for Y48 or Y49 going to Mexico. So we consider those illegal shipments. The plastics are flowing mightily right now, unfortunately, by truck across the border, Y48 plastics. With electronics, not as much, but it's flowing somewhat from our observations. But unless Mexico, because they can't use the OECD agreement because the objections of Japan and formerly of the US, they need to have a valid agreement which includes Y48 and Y49 with the US in order to do it legally. But there's a lot of lack of control going on the Mexican side, almost zero enforcement. They just got through an election. Hopefully things will get tighter there. But yeah, it's a very porous border right now, and a lot of journalists, et cetera, are starting to look at what's happening on the receiving end, particularly of the plastic waste. And you can expect more and more exposés about that. The problem is so many of these recyclers is the recycling is only partial. So they can make money on part of the load of the mixed plastics, but they can't recycle it all economically. So the question is, what do you do with it? And it gets dumped and burned more often than not. So this is the real problem.
All right. Thank you for that, Jim. The next question here is specific for US-based recyclers. Is incineration through a waste-to-energy program acceptable as an alternative to landfilling plastics, given they cannot be exported to usual routes?
Yeah, we've looked into this. We were going to put in our guide a whole list of all the waste-to-energy facilities, but when I started talking to some of the actual practitioners of waste-to-energy, they are not happy with burning plastic by itself, believe it or not. They're not geared up to burn such intense calorie waste streams. And so they're not ready to really receive what we would send to them in most instances, is what we learned. So we refrained from putting all those out there. But if you were to find one that is fully permitted and has all the pollution controls, et cetera, it would be acceptable as acceptable as landfill. And I know both of those are not ideal. But That's the best I can do for you. We may add some more information on that in the second edition of our guide.
And under R2, it says when there's no technically viable recycling processes available, then the R2 facility may direct material to the most environmentally beneficial option of energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal. So the facility needs to determine whether or not that energy recovery is more beneficial than landfilling and have that documented.
Perfect. Thank you both for that. The next question here is, are we tracking how much North American e-plastics processing capacity has increased in recent years? And if so, do we have a volume figure for that increase at all?
I don't have any figures for you. The next edition of the guide will anecdotally tell you who's entered into the fray. We will try to get an estimate of their capacity. A lot of times the capacity grows with the demand, of course, and you can stand up these sink float facilities over time. Doesn't take that much time. Once you embark on that road, certain recyclers could add capacity if they saw the market. So a lot of it has to do with Malaysia, whether they're still going to be illegally importing this material or whether they clamp down. If we were to look at what they're doing with e-waste right now, it looks like they're waking up from a slumber and they're starting to clamp down on the flows. I would say it's a real tsunami of material, and that includes plastic as well. But they need to do the same with plastics. If they start to enforce the Basel Convention, then certainly there's going to be more demand in North America.
Yeah, and we don't have hard numbers as well, just kind of general knowledge about facilities popping up.
Perfect. All right, next question is it correct to say that a US recycler can ship mixed plastics to the EU, UK, or any OECD country as 3210 under the PIC process?
Well, this is a question that it came up earlier because this came about much earlier than the e-waste ones. And we had some North American e-Stewards recyclers who wanted to ship things to Europe, the plastics, the Y48. And they were able to get agreement with certain countries there that they could ship it as A3210. So they're calling it hazardous, even though it's technically maybe not, because the OECD includes the hazardous listing. They don't include Y48 because of the objection by the United States. But because there's no objection on the hazardous listing, I had suggested go ahead and see if the competent authority in Europe would agree that you could ship it as A3210, and that apparently happened. Anybody that wants more information about that, I can perhaps connect you with some of the actors that were involved in that. But I think it is an avenue. It will, of course, require PIC, but it's not a ban. It's not a ban just because there's no listing in the OECD agreement.
And I think, that OECD listing that I mentioned, most countries were saying that if Y48 was recognized, that it would move under PIC anyways. So either way, it's going to move under PIC, which would probably have, environmentally sound management either way for those, and it's going from OECD to OECD. So there is less risk there.
Yeah, the main thing is you need both countries to agree. So they have to be involved at the government level.
Perfect. Next would be, and this is a similar question to what we just talked about, but can a recycler send mixed plastics to a reputable recycler in developed countries like Great Britain or those in the EU?
Well, that's the same question, I think. Those are OECD countries. UK not being EU, they're still OECD. Mexico's OECD, Canada's OECD, all of Europe is OECD, basically. So again, you would have to do it as a hazardous listing, or otherwise through the agreement by both countries involved.
Unless it was single polymer falling under those exceptions there.
Exactly. I'm talking about mixed, yeah.
Yes. All right. Okay, so next one is, does the e-waste amendment cover exported working equipment, I'm assuming for reuse, or just for equipment being recycled?
Yeah, so this is important. I left it out of my presentation, probably trying to real hard to keep it short. But if something is fully functional, it's not a waste. It's not part of the Basel Convention. So some countries will even allow things for repair. It's highly controversial right now. There is a guidance document at the Basel Convention which mentions the criteria you have to follow if you're going to claim repair as being a non-waste, a repair destination. You can look up that. There's 5 criteria there. We think they're too weak. They don't allow enough transparency. But we're sympathetic, obviously, to reuse. But we're hoping that folks will bring things up to the point where they're fully functional, and maybe the final touches of refurbishment and cleaning it and making it ready for market could be done in the receiving country. But if you've got something fully functional, and there are some definitions of that in the guidance documents at Basel, basically all the key functions need to be working as designed, then you consider that as a non-waste and declare it as such. It's used working equipment.
So it wouldn't fall under the e-waste amendments. It could move freely, essentially.
Yes, exactly. So it's not a waste, so it's outside of Basel's realm entirely.
All right. This person says, looking for more clarification, US and Canada can no longer trade e-waste, or will this be allowed under pick and permit? Which I believe was also answered, but if you just want to reiterate that.
Well, the problem mainly is with this new Y49. If the e-waste is hazardous e-waste, there is an existing bilateral agreement between Canada and the US, but it would have to be by pick. But if it's Y49, technically from a legal standpoint, Canada and the US have not agreed to put Y49 in any kind of Article 11 agreement. They could do it really easily by adding Y49, for example, to the existing bilateral agreement, which dates back to the 80s. But they haven't done that. So there's no legal basis for moving electronic toys or household appliances across that border. So I've tried to wave my flag and say, you guys need to fix this. They have, 6 months or so to do it. But they haven't indicated to us that they're going to do that. They may do it yet. But one thing the Canadian government did tell me is that any future trade in Basel controlled waste, regardless, is going to use a pick procedure. There's not going to be any more free trade agreements like they did with plastics. That's what they assured me.
And I think Canada hasn't yet made a decision on exactly what legislation they're going to put into place. So that would likely need to be in place before any type of bilateral could be reached as well.
All right. Next question is, will Y49 impact Zorba?
That one of the
Zorba is a REMA, formerly known as ISRI category of mixed non-ferrous metals, I believe. I am not an expert on Zorba, but I believe it can contain hazardous materials last time I looked at that situation. So lead can get mixed into that, etc. So therefore, Zorba would not qualify as being Y49. It would probably be A1181, hazardous electronics. Either way, it's going to require pick controls as a minimum. I hope I answered that question. I forgot.
would that not fall under B1250, or is that it?
Well,
only if it's
it has to be clean and non-dispersible to be one of these B listings. So I don't think Zorba qualifies, but if somebody wants to counter that, send me the specifications. I can take another look at it.
All right. Next question here is, can IT products such as notebooks or mobile phones still ship across border for repair, which I think you answered with our previous question about what falls under the control of the Basel Convention or not. So I don't know if you want to, it's specific to repair, not reuse.
Yeah, again, certain countries are picking up this guidance document, which has been adopted at an interim level. It's still highly controversial. A lot of countries are not accepting this repair as being non-waste, but some countries may. I'm not sure of any that have actually done this, but the manufacturers of electronics, for example, argued vociferously for this exception, and repair can be possible following those 5 criteria, but beware, because a lot of countries do not agree to that guideline, and the convention trumps the guideline. The guideline is just that. It's not legally binding unless both countries involved agree it is.
Okay. This person says a couple of slides mentioned during the pick procedure as being the default control. Is there any other type of control under the Basel Convention that does not involve pick?
Yes, so these are the prohibitions. And then there's also pick with conditionality. So countries can basically do their own rules for each country of how they want to control things. Pick is the basic default, but some countries will say, you got to do pick, but you got to do a little more than that. You got to give us extra information or what have you. So the competent authorities of each country really calls the shots. But again, we basically broke down the control procedures into pick, versions of it, and then prohibitions. And the party to non-party prohibition is what's really hurting the US. Until the US ratifies the Basel Convention, this is going to really put a damper on a lot of the trade which the rest of the world can undertake. For example, with the pick procedure, the US is not even able to do that. So this is what happened with plastics. If the US had been a party, they could export to Malaysia with the pick procedure. So they could have, with the Y-48, they could have exported that because it's not technically a hazardous waste. That would have been banned to Malaysia. But because it's on this Annex 2, it requires pick. But because the US is not part of the Basel Convention, Malaysia is not allowed to trade with US unless there's a special bilateral agreement. And the only bilateral agreement between Malaysia and the US works for exports from Malaysia to the US, not the other way around.
Okay, there's a couple Canada specific questions that were submitted, so I'd like to kind of group them together so we can hopefully answer everything all at once. So to start, this person says that they are located in Canada, and to their knowledge, the government has not yet finalized the new A and Y codes in legislation yet. It says it takes sometimes a minimum of 3 to 4 months for export permits. And obviously that is a pretty tight timeline. So doesn't that mean that it will be next to impossible to legally export anything come January 2025?
Yeah, I'm not sure of all the timelines, et cetera, with the national law in Canada. I know that Canada is going to adopt and implement the Basel Ban Amendment, and they're going to push that through. They've told me that everything will require pick, but whether they're going to open the doors to Y-49, if that's what you're referring to, I believe they're intending to do that. I believe that Canada is fully intending to be ready for this amendment when it comes into force. If there's a delay that's due to parliamentary procedures or whatever, then I'm not aware of that, but inquire with your parliamentarian.
Another one that was submitted that is connected, similar in this situation. It says if Canada has until January 15th, which I believe is when they can submit, any type of information on what they'll do, won't all shipments be paused from Canada to the US and vice versa starting on January 1st?
I think the January 15th deadline that Mike referred to is the OECD puts out a questionnaire, then they post the results of what all the countries are going to do when there's no consensus. And they've done that for plastics already. The period between January 1 and January 15, I do not have a good answer for you. I would assume that if something has not been announced in some other way, then it will be assumed to be the old procedure. But it's a real question mark. It's a gray area for sure. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
All right. Are we aware of any Article 11 agreements that may be likely that I'm assuming for the e-waste specifically?
I am not. We talked briefly with the Malaysian government. They said they had, there was a lot of reports that they had great facilities for plastics and that it would make sense to have a bilateral. They were not interested, nor was the US government. And then we found out that we're not so sure that there are any really environmentally sound recycling facilities for plastics in Malaysia. We keep finding that all of these look really good on the floor in the fence line, but they are dumping outside the fence line. So this is something to be aware of. You can go visit places in Malaysia and they give you a great tour, but what they don't tell you is what they do with the fractions they don't recycle. And this is the problem. They're dumped all over the neighborhood, and we're documenting those right now. So that's the situation. I don't know of any bilaterals that make sense at this point. We haven't heard, though, except for Canada and Mexico. They need to really think about that. But I've inquired with Canada and the US. It makes perfect sense for them to do one for Y49 or add it to an existing one, but they have indicated no interest in that to me.
Okay. I guess keeping with the Mexico situation here, this person asks pretty specifically, Mexico can export e-waste to Japan without PIC, but do we have any basis or documents that support that? I think, is that correct? And do we have any documents that support that?
You mean after January 1?
Yes.
Right now they can, certainly. No, they need to use PIC if it's hazardous electronics. If it's not, they don't need to use PIC under the current situation because they're both OECD countries. And so the OECD would have a green list for the non-hazardous or an amber list for the hazardous. Amber requires a form of PIC. It's streamlined PIC, but it's PIC. With the new situation, Japan has objected. We're not sure exactly why Japan did that. It seems like they want to bring in waste from the US because the US is not a Basel party. So by not putting it into the OECD, Japan could set up an arrangement with the US to receive certain things like circuit boards, etc. We're not sure completely of their analysis of why they're doing this objection. It's very disruptive. But it would seem to me that Mexico, being a Basel party, Japan being a Basel party, if there's no other agreement that's consistent with Basel, they would have to use the Basel regime, which means that PIC would apply.
Hey, Jim,
Yeah.
didn't Japan in their alternate proposal offer a new category specifically for circuit boards, which would be not controlled by PIC and might be the reason for their objection?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned. I think they're all about bringing in circuit boards from a country that creates a lot of circuit boards like the US into like their smelter, Dowa, what have you. That was their intention, I believe, but it's creating a lot of problems, and I'm hoping they reconsider because it again locks the US out of things. They will not be able to use the OECD agreement for Y49.
I think that kind of leads us into another question here that was submitted, which says, does shredded circuit boards being exported from the US to other OECD countries fall under those Y49 or A1181 codes?
Well, you'd have to really look at the analysis of the circuit boards. I think most circuit boards, even the RoHS compliant ones that have less lead in them, they still fail a T-clip test. Most countries still feel that circuit boards of all types are hazardous, so A1181. So I hope that answers your question. So that would avoid a lot of tricky analysis and chemical analysis, just to consider them A1181 and go with a PIC procedure for OECD countries.
And then similar to that question here, could circuit boards such as RAM and motherboards continue to be sent to refiners in the US? Which I think the
Sure.
answer was. All right. Next, talking specifically, there's a couple questions about manufacturers. So it says, dealing with manufacturers specifically, does this apply into their EPR programs? Are they aware? Are they taking action? And this person is saying this, just thinking of the message to corporate clients to get ahead and plan correctly.
Very good question. We have alerted folks in the OEM community for sure. We haven't attempted to solve their problems for them in terms of their EPR programs and what this means, but we know it's potentially very serious because the EPR programs require that you recycle a certain amount, right? And if you can't send it to Malaysia for recycling, if it's plastics in this case, and you have to landfill it, you're not going to meet your EPR goals, and some of those are legislated in the law. So it can be a serious issue. We've raised it with them. We don't feel we're in a good place to solve that problem for them, but it's in their court at the moment. Mike, do you have anything you want to add to that dialogue with the OEMs?
I know that we just reached out to them about what we're doing with the R2 equipment categorization, and we're trying to get all interested parties engaged in the discussion to figure out what we can best do moving forward.
And with the e-waste, it's really, I mean, considering what happened with plastics, we didn't anticipate a lot of the problems that we saw arise, and they're still existing now. I've tried to get a crystal ball and give you the best shot I have of what this might mean in terms of implications, but every time you make a piece of sweeping legislation, there's always something the legislators didn't consider that is a perverse effect or a strange effect. I think a lot of the recyclers have the best handle on what is this going to mean, particularly for them. So this, hopefully, by giving this webinar, we've given you some time to really think it through. And there may be some impacts that we haven't talked about in this webinar. I would love it if you think of something to shoot it my way, because I'm constantly being asked in conferences, etc. What does it all mean? What do we need to anticipate? I just spoke at Basel about this. I mentioned the Canadian-US border, for example. But anything else that you can think of impacts, it's better to know sooner than later. So please share those with Mike and myself.
All right. I think that there's a couple questions specific about whether or not we can speak to the manufacturers encouraging use of more recycled e-plastics, and whether or not we know any information about that, which I'm not sure if we can technically answer, but that was something that is a common theme in the Q&A here. So I don't know if either of you have anything to add about that, but there was several questions about that.
Yeah, I really don't. It's a subject for a whole new webinar, post-consumer plastic use and how to incentivize that, etc. I do think The OEMs need to speak about this. I think a lot of it is lip service at the moment, unfortunately. And if it's real, if you can really use post-consumer plastic in a safe way, we need to start really incentivizing that. In Europe, they're starting to create laws to make it happen. We don't have those in the US. But it's a really good subject for another webinar, if not a whole conference.
All right. Well, the next one here that we have is, when do the two certification bodies anticipate rules to be published on how auditors will qualify exports as going for legitimate reuse or repair for material that would otherwise qualify as Y49?
So, Lena, do you want to talk about our dialogue with the CVs?
Yeah. So I can share.
We don't have all the answers yet, but we're working on it.
Correct. Yeah. So we are currently in process on the e-Stewards side and speaking with the certification bodies that certify to e-Stewards, and just sharing with them, not only talking about the recent sanction interpretations that were published and how that can affect the auditing procedures there, but also just talking about in general, what these amendments mean, how they, interact with e-Steward processors, and really what, auditors should be looking for and how they could write up any cases of noncompliance. So that is a current dialogue that we are having, that we are scheduled for. And it's something that we hope to continue to expand on, as well as just continuing that communication with our certification bodies and auditors specifically, in cases where they may have questions, and getting those answered on how to best, tackle those things when they are found. So I think it's an ongoing dialogue, especially on the e-Steward side. I don't know if, Mike, you have anything to add there, but obviously with the 2021 amendments that went into place, as well as the 2025 ones, it's been something that's ongoing throughout the years here that we hope to continue to expand on.
Yeah, and we are putting together our continued education module for November for auditors, specifically on the Basel amendments, so they would understand those better. In terms of stuff going for reuse, repair, refurbishment versus what's going for materials recovery, I think auditors may already be a little bit equipped to look at that to determine, how is it being sold? Is it being sold by the unit or by the pound? Various other things like packaging might also signify that. So I don't know how much more of a stretch we would need to give the auditors, rather than to kind of reinforce the concepts of looking at certain things that might indicate reuse over material recovery streams.
That makes sense. And there actually is another additional question specific for R2 that ties along with this a little bit. It says, does reuse equipment have to be fully functional, or are key functions allowed?
So I guess that depends on where the international movement, if there's international movement, and if so, where is it going? Does that country require that the equipment be fully functional for direct reuse by the end user? Then potentially the key functions working would not be something that's allowable. But the R2 facility needs to look at where they're sending that material and make the determination of whether or not something besides fully functional is considered a waste or not.
Perfect. We had 3 separate questions come in that I think all are pretty related here. And I guess even I can answer this if we want to, but it's specific to talking about after January 1st, 2025, about e-waste. Can it be shipped from the US or to the US? Which I think we kind of answered here, that there's currently no valid Article 11 agreements for that Y49 code. So essentially the answer would be no, unless it falls under, what is it, the other potential Annex 9 codes that are currently in Basel. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Unless somebody also comes up with a bilateral agreement, but right now there's none.
Okay. So that answers 3 of those. Let's see if there's anything.
A lot of good questions here.
Yeah, a lot of very specific questions.
Yeah.
So I think we already answered that one. Let's see if there's anything else. The only other one that we have here is just speaking to the pie chart, Jim, that was in part of your presentation for the computer plastic percentages. It says, can you show the pie chart again? And are you able to expand with any examples on where to find these types? I don't know if we want to dive deep into that, but maybe if we can pull up at least the pie chart again so that can be reviewed and they can take a look. But
Well, we're going to make this whole presentation available. That is not a pie chart we created. It was created in Europe. I think it's still quite valid, though, in terms of the variety of different things. And it would take quite a lot of time to analyze each one and figure out where the markets are for all those fractions. But just rest assured, we'll get you that chart. I think it is really useful to take a look at. It certainly explains why e-plastic is Y49. I mean, Y48, sorry, it's mixed. So yeah, it's a conundrum for all the recyclers on how to get it unmixed and marketed.
all right. So I think we have one final question here. And that is just if we are able to speak a little bit more to the classification of black mass. I know you mentioned that earlier in your presentation. If you're able to just explain that a little bit better for those listening still.
Sure. The Basel Convention has not weighed in on this. They will. It'll take some time. We have looked at it and realized there's a lot of different ways to prepare black mass. And sometimes you could say that they've gotten all the hazards out of it. There are some fluorinated compounds in lithium-ion batteries that are of concern. And a lot of the ways of making black mass can burn those off, which is not really good for the environment, but they will not exist anymore in the black mass. There's other things. There could be heavy metals. There still could be some flammability. But regardless of whether it's hazardous or not, it fits the definition of Y49 as being a process residue that originated with electronics. So I'm almost certain that it will be considered Y49. I don't see a good argument around that, even if it's not considered hazardous. Now, lithium-ion batteries, I make the case that those should be considered hazardous waste. But right now, there's a lack of enforcement and controls on both of those. And they need to get solidified more quickly because, as you know, we're the mountains of waste that everybody anticipates from EV batteries and power banks is just starting to flow. And that mountain is just starting to build. And we need to know what the controls are so it doesn't all get exported to developing countries.
All right. And then we just had one final quick question come through. And I think we can probably cap it there. Is PCABS considered a single polymer?
Oh, that is the question I've heard before. And so these are the kind of things that when people write a law, they don't think about how it really works on the real world. And I would think that at a certain point, there will be guidance, either starting probably from the EU, that it is a polymer, should be considered as a single polymer, the way it's been explained to me. But right now, there's no clarification of that in any Basel text or guidance that I know about. So what it could mean is that an individual country can interpret it the way I am interpreting it, but you'd need their sign off on it because it's not a listed single polymer. It does look like it's two polymers joined together, but the way it works in the real world is it's a single polymer. So I think you'd need to get sign off with perhaps some specifications and reasons why you want that to be considered that way. and hopefully can get sympathetic, competent authorities that you can see it their way. They can see it your way. Sorry. Have you had that question, Mike?
I have not had that question
Yeah.
specifically, no.
Yeah.
But if we didn't get to anyone's questions, our emails are up here, and if you don't feel comfortable reaching out through the Q&A session here, please feel free to email us. We'd be happy to try to answer any of your questions or point you in the right direction.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that is it for the questions submitted. I think we tackled almost all of them. But yes, again, just reiterating what Mike said, obviously reach out to any of us for any either more specific questions or something that we weren't able to address here in this presentation. As Jim mentioned also, we will be making this whole presentation available. So we will make sure to send out communication where that can be located once this is all completed. But otherwise, I mean, I would just personally like to thank everybody for joining us today. And I don't know, Mike and Jim, if you have any final closing comments before we end this.
No, I'm just very impressed with the turnout. That's a good sign, and I'm really impressed with the questions. And there will be more questions, so feel free to reach out to us. We will post this as the recording. We'll also post it as a PDF, so you can grab individual slides for further study. It was a lot of material to throw into one presentation, and I think it will be useful to go back and take a look.
Yeah, thank you for listening to us talk for almost 2 hours about really dense stuff. I know you have more important things to do with your life, and so we appreciate your attendance and asking questions.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.